I wrote Mike Ferris a letter and I said, "Hey, Mike, great news. You don't know me, you've never heard of me, but I'm coming to work for you soon when I finish law school." And that didn't happen. I finished law school. I worked as a clerk for an appellate court. And then I went to work for the General Counsel of National Right to Life Committee and did free speech cases, mostly on behalf of state right to life groups.
Welcome to the Frontline with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the Frontline. All right, well, thanks for joining us. Jim Mason is the president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, HSLDA, so really thankful that you could join us today on the Frontline, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Well, it's my pleasure, and nice to see you again.
All right. Well, the interesting, there's all kinds of interesting things going on with homeschooling all the time. It's always interesting to hear about the latest thing that some homeschool student has come up with or some homeschool graduate is doing these days. But none of that could happen without the freedom that we have to homeschool. And so I wanted to talk with you a little bit about HSLDA, some of the challenges that we're facing now, but also kind of your role, your position, kind of how you ended up there a little bit. And so let's go ahead and start with that. Where did you start and end up with HSLDA? How did that happen?
Well, it's a bit of a longer story than some. I was commissioned as an officer in the Navy, did 4 years on active duty. Then I kind of went from one thing to another along the way. The Lord really persuaded me to kind of get back on the path that I'd strayed from, and I started over in life after kind of starting out into the career world. Framed houses for 3.5 years. And during that time, early in my carpentry phase, married my wife Debbie, which that's almost exactly 40 years ago now. And we had a kid, and after we had our first child, Luke, we had our first two. I was recalled to active duty for Operation Desert Storm, and by that time I was actually in the sheriff's. I'd become a parole and probation officer in the sheriff's department. When I went over to the Middle East for Desert Storm, it just kind of opened my eyes to thinking that there's a bigger world out there than my little hometown of Corvallis, Oregon. And came home. We had just started homeschooling Luke, and I started getting these magazines in the mail called The Teaching Home. You are old enough that you were a child, and you might remember those when you were a child.
Yep.
And they had these little vignettes in the article or in the magazine of things that were happening around the world, around the United States, in the legal world of homeschooling. And they came from this little outfit in Peonian Springs, Virginia, called Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And so I became kind of motivated to go back to law school, and I discovered Regent University School of Law, which seemed like a bit of an oxymoron because it was a Christian law school. And it was just kind of a stunning revelation to me that there would be such a thing, it even existed. And the Lord made it possible for us to move from Oregon to Virginia, and I went to law school. And I wrote Mike Ferris a letter and I said, "Hey, Mike, great news. You don't know me, you've never heard of me, but back in law, I'm coming to work for you soon when I finish law school." And that didn't happen. I finished law school. I worked as a clerk for an appellate court. And then I went to work for the General Counsel of National Right to Life Committee and did free speech cases, mostly on behalf of state right to life groups. And after I was there for about 3 years, a good friend of mine stopped in our house in Indiana on their vacation and he said, "Hey, I moved to Virginia and I go to church with this guy named Mike Ferris." I said, "Wow, I would really like to go work there someday." A couple months later, I got an email from him on Sunday. He said, "Hey, Jim, I was just in church with Mike Ferris today, and he said there's an opening for a lawyer at HSLDA." And I said, "I know a guy." And the rest is history. That was in 2001. I joined HSLDA as in charge of the litigation department for in 2001, where I've done a lot of different things along the way for HSLDA in addition to litigation. And then Mike Smith, one of our founders, was the president, and he retired in 2022. And the board asked me if I would like to be president of HSLDA. Considering my other options, I said yes. And it's been an honor and a privilege for me to work here, and to really kind of see the Lord work in my life to help me go from where I was to where I am. And it's part of His plan for my life. It's just been a great joy for me to find myself here in this place at this time.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's an incredible story. Like you said, it's not the average story of ending up in a job. I was thinking about how you've done a number of different things, like you said, at HSLDA, and in addition to your other parts of your life, different career things. And throughout the time that you've been with HSLDA, there's been a range of challenges, which is what HSLDA does. I mean, the HSLDA takes on challenges. What would you say? I'm thinking about in terms of where we've come from and where we stand today. What would you say is the situation with homeschool freedom in our country today compared to where we've been in the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. So back in those early days when I was reading the Teaching Home snippets of legal cases going on around the country, it was homeschool freedom was just kind of getting started. It was not uncommon back in those days for families to be prosecuted for homeschooling because they didn't have a teaching certificate. In Texas and Michigan and numerous other places, that was the norm. And we always say that back then in those early days, homeschooling was either actually illegal, incorrectly thought to be illegal, or and at the very best was disfavored all across the country, pretty much every state. So places like Texas, a case that we were involved in back in the 90s, people were getting prosecuted, but the case went to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled no, they should never have been prosecuted because they actually qualified to be a private school, which is familiar to California homeschoolers who
Right.
homeschool under a private school option. And then in Michigan, the Supreme Court of Michigan held that a family who had been prosecuted and convicted of truancy had a religious freedom right to homeschool. And shortly thereafter, the legislature adopted a homeschool law. In places like North Dakota, people were getting prosecuted all the time. And I think this was before my time, but HSLDA took 7 or 8 cases to the Supreme Court of North Dakota, lost all but one. And the one they won was on a technicality where the prosecutor forgot to put in evidence that the child lived in the county. So,
Wow. Whoops.
yeah. And finally, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but it should be. It has been handed down to me, whether it's apocryphal or true, that the Supreme Court got tired of talking to Mike Ferris and kind of told the legislature, you need to do something about this. And so the legislature passed a homeschooling law. And you go today, homeschooling is not disfavored. It's a recognized stop on the education menu that any parent can consider. And, it's the boundaries of freedom have been moved back about as far as they can in most places. And that puts us in an interesting spot because the opponents of homeschool freedom haven't gone away, and there are many vocal, influential, ideological opponents to homeschool freedom and parental rights who would work to push back the freedoms and even return to the bad old days. So one of our bête noire, Professor Elizabeth Bartholet in Harvard Law School in 2020 actually published a law review article saying that homeschooling should be banned because the people who do it are basically bad people, religious fundamentalists who want to keep, she had a lot of allegations that are basically not true about the typical homeschool family. And then the world shut down because of COVID, and pretty much everybody was homeschooling, so that sort of took the wind out of her sails for a while. But she's back. She just published a new article earlier this year where she based it on the Pierce v. Society of Sisters case, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary, where the Supreme Court of the United States said that Oregon's ban on private education was unconstitutional, and famously said, the child is not the mere creature of the state. And so Elizabeth Bartholet said, well, she loved the case because it eventually led to Roe v. Wade and the right to abortion, but she hated the case because it affirmed parental rights as fundamental. So she just published that a couple of months ago. And then there are, just numerous efforts around the country. I think in response to the exodus from public schools caused by COVID, it's sort of panicking school officials to try to get kids back in school. Some do it with carrots and some do it with sticks. So a case we just did, can I go into a recent case?
Yeah, absolutely.
Recent case, it's not in California, it was in Pennsylvania. There's a trend around the country for school officials to ask for more documentation than what the statutes allow. And in Pennsylvania, parents can begin homeschooling by filing a sworn declaration stating certain facts, one of those facts being that the primary educator has a high school diploma. Well, this school district started asking parents to provide a copy of the diploma in addition to swearing in the affidavit that they hold one. And many parents, we didn't know this, and apparently the school district's been doing this for a couple of years. But a couple of parents who had just moved into Pennsylvania from other states and were HSLDA members called us up and said, hey, the law doesn't say that I have to give them a copy of my high school diploma. Why should I do that? And we said, well, you don't have to. So the school district actually started calling the parents that we were working with. They called and left a voicemail and said, if you don't give us the diploma, if you don't agree to give us the diploma today, we're going to be at your house tomorrow at 8 a.m. and you can give it to us there. And so the attendance officer and the school social worker showed up at their home at 8 o'clock the next morning. And the social worker said, and our family said, no, we're not legally required to. And oh, by the way, if you have a problem with our homeschooling, the homeschool statute says you've got to send me a certified letter. And so the official said, we don't need no stinking certified letters. And the social worker said, oh, and by the way, we need to see your children to make sure they're safe. So that was early in September. That was on a Friday. On Tuesday, we'd sued the school district. And I should say, we had exchanged letters with the school district's lawyer. And it was very dismissive responses, like, oh, we've been doing this, we can do this, and you can't tell us we can't. And if you don't, we'll prosecute you for truancy. So Friday, they did it. Tuesday, we sued them. 2 days ago, Monday, the school board voted to agree with us that what the school wanted to do was not contrary to law. And so that's just that's a very recent example of school officials who try to just get a little bit more out of homeschoolers. And HSLDA's practice has always been, we encourage people to follow the law, but no more. So whatever the law is. because if the school officials or other officials, start demanding a little bit more, pretty soon they're demanding a lot more,
Right.
and that's how the slippery slope that we lose our freedoms in. Then, of course, you and I, back when you were just a knee high to a grasshopper in the FPM world, worked together in the 2008 California homeschool case, which was a very big highlight for me in my legal career.
Yeah. And it still is a very important case that we certainly rely on here in California.
Right. It was one of
Is
those
that
cases. It was a case that I classify as officials thought that homeschooling was illegal, and they were wrong. And so when the California Court of Appeals said homeschooling is illegal and never has been legal in 2008, we worked together with a coalition of others to get that reversed. And so, in February they said it's illegal. In August they said, "Oops, we were wrong." And it not only is it legal, but it's always been legal.
Right. And I remember during that time, I mean, you mentioned a coalition of others. I mean, there were people throughout California, but across the country that were, pitching in to help with that case. And I'm just, what are your thoughts on the implications of that case being decided the way it was for not just California, but for the rest of the country?
Well, the very first implication back in 2008 was, in those weeks and months when it was in the balance. So just to reflect back, the court ruled it was unconstitutional at the end of February 2008. And we filed a motion to reconsider, which are honestly rarely granted. But you had a very short time period to do that, 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from the order, we filed that motion. And the court granted the motion to reconsider, which had the effect of vacating the ruling that said it was illegal. But so in that time from when the order was granted and before the final order, so we had several weeks to file our own briefs and coordinate with others. So the Christian Home Education Association of California, CHIA, participated in one of the amicus briefs. It was one of the more influential amicus briefs because it was a Christian homeschooling organization paired with a secular homeschooling organization that don't agree about everything, but they agree that parents should be free to homeschool. And so what was interesting about that amicus brief, there was sort of a strange bedfellows joining in one brief, but they each had kind of big time California law firms who had lawyers who were homeschooling their kids, gave their time pro bono, both, from kind of the more conservative homeschooling and a more liberal homeschooling perspective, and they joined together in this one brief. And then I actually worked on coordinating 16 amicus briefs from groups around the country, including several members of Congress. But in that time frame, the expectation was that they were going to look at it again and rule it the same way again.
Right.
And so the implications of that would have been, well, the saying is, as goes California, so goes the nation. And when they completely reverse themselves, this is almost unheard of, where a 3-judge panel of experienced, long-standing judges rule on a case one way, and then 5 months later, rule in the exact opposite way. It's just kind of unprecedented in my experience. But that's what happened. And so now the implication is, don't mess with the homeschoolers.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else that you want to close with? I know that I always encourage people to join HSLDA, to reach out when they have legal issues related to homeschooling, but I think there's a huge benefit to the existence of HSLDA, whether you're a homeschooling parent or not. Yeah, anything else you'd like to close with?
Yeah, I'll just expand on what you said. We are, we are member supported and donation supported, And, as a member, if you come into legal trouble with respect to your homeschooling, you have a lawyer at your, a phone call 24/7. But when we do things for one family, we like to view it as we're doing it for all the other families. So the 2008 California case, we had done all these little cases, unremarkable, nobody knew about them much. And there were, I did like maybe half a dozen or more cases on a very little issue where I learned the legal arguments that we ended up using to save the freedom to homeschool for everybody in California. So when you're a member of HSLDA or supporter of us, there are personal benefits, but it's really to help the cause for everybody else. So we work on behalf of one family so that all families can be free.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that, and for keeping things going. Thanks for saying yes to being invited to be the president, and I'm glad you're there, and glad HSLDA is still strong and going, and look forward to many more years of freedom.
Well, let me just give a pitch for Family Protection Ministries also. I've known Nathan now since 2008, and Jim Davis and Roy Hansen before that. Family Protection Ministries does a lot of behind-the-scenes work that you may not know about, but it's vital, it's important, and you should support them as much as you can, because it's the kind of dedicated long-term work that keeps homeschooling free in California.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.